Hey everyone, I'm back again after what feels like a lifetime of Fulton extracting as well as trekking mountains with back-breaking cargo. Not really something I want to do all over again anytime soon. But what I am going through right now is giving myself a link to the past through the games of old from 8 to 16-bit and anything else that echoes that time period. Nowadays the sea of indies is overwhelming. I'll never run out of titles to talk about. In fact, it's so big that I can filter out all of the shit ones and still have an infinite pool of good games to talk about, which is something that I have done from the beginning of this channel and it's not going to change. And in this video, I will be continuing that train of thought through a game that is well known in certain circles, more specifically the Pico 8 community and fans of the 28 platformer game Celeste. But the 2018 game isn't the one that I'm going to be talking too much about, but rather the game that set the roots for what would come and still remains one of the finest platformers that you can find today. I'm talking about Celeste Classic. Throughout history, we have moments where we catch lightning in a bottle, with a game that stands the test of time and comes close to perfection, doing almost everything right. Celeste 2018 was one of those games, expertly woven with arguably the most realized and well implemented platformer mechanics that you'll find in a platformer game today. Its inception, however, was engineered with the DNA of Celeste Classic, its predecessor. And what is Celeste Classic exactly? Well, to help paint the picture here, I'll have to do a quick refresher of the platform that it's based on and what it represents for retro gaming. So, Celeste Classic is made with a platform called the Pico 8. And what is the Pico 8, you may ask? Well, it's everything that encompasses a retro console, but only in digital form. The most common term associated with it is fantasy console. A fantasy console is a console that never existed, but can be found on the internet. It bases its concepts on the principles of limited hardware and game design back in the day, only working within the boundaries that are provided for it. It's not unlike the days of the old Atari, Sega, and Nintendo consoles back in the 80s and the 90s, where the technology was somewhat limited. You could only do so much with the games that you could make, especially with the NES, where games were usually short and very limited in their graphical prowess. Sure, there were outliers like the first three Final Fantasy titles, Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda that provided more content where you could play for hours, but even they had to make compromises to make the scale of those games possible on such a platform like the NES. The SNES, or the Super Nintendo, was no different, but more significant improvements were made across the board, as well as the quality of those games too. Pico 8 is a reflection of those periods in gaming. Games were relatively small and very quick to beat, but were flexible in the genres that could be made with Pico 8. Pico 8 itself would come with a full package, coming in with its own color palette, a music maker, a tile mapping system, sprite drawing, and even a code editor that enabled rapid development and modification of existing games. It was more than just a retro game engine, but a gaming console without the box. What would come out of it would be a treasure trove of creative and interesting titles that would flood the indie scene in digital cartridges and retro graphics. Celeste Classic would be one of those games. Developed by Madeline Stephanie Thorson, also known as Maddie Makes Games, who had made Towerfall and eventually the 2018 release of Celeste. Celeste Classic's foundations would stem from a game jam back in 2015 where the Pico 8 platform would be utilized. With the assistance of a lead programmer named Barry, they were able to conjure a combination of Towerfall and Super Mario Bros. 3 that would ultimately comprise in the creation of, well, Celeste, which is now known as Celeste Classic. Every platform has a champion title that represents its identity and the type of games that come with it, and gives players a reason to get onto that platform in the first place. The consoles from before all had games that made you want to buy them. Celeste Classic for me is the Pico 8's flag title. It's been changed and modified more than any other game that I've seen so far, and it's due to how accessible the source code for games are, which I will get into a bit later on. Celeste Classic is essentially an early concept of the 2018 release, and yet it still feels really satisfying to play. It's quick to pick up, hard as nails, and can be beaten really quickly if you have no soul whatsoever. You can find the game on the Pico 8 app itself, but good luck finding the original version of it. or on the Lexophil website that hosts the game, and as well as a whole bunch of other cartridges, which is what I would recommend to do, to be honest, if you want to play the official game. You have the title screen and then you press start. It's really that simple. And it's something that a lot of Pico 8 games have in common too, by the way. Then you have control of your character. It's pretty standard fare with the controls themselves. You use the D-pad to move around. You're assigned A or B buttons or Z and X buttons to like move about. You can play it with the mouse and keyboard or with a controller, but for this particular game, I would highly recommend playing with a controller. It's much more comfortable, but to each their own. Now, aside from the controls, the mechanics are the real meat and potatoes here. Celeste Classic feels amazing to play, and this was a game that predated Celeste 2018, which fully realizes those controls and mechanics. The dash mechanic that you have here, indicated by the changing of colors with your hair, will be your main approach to traversing each ascent towards the summit, which is your goal in this game. There's no story like the 2018 version, you just make your way up and that's it. All 3,000 meters of levels filled with strawberries and spikes. At first it's pretty easy. The game does a really good job with providing accessible levels to get you familiar with the dash and how it works, as well as the wall jumping, getting used to the rhythm of it. Your hair is red and then changes color afterwards, indicating that the dash has been used, which is a good way of communicating that it's in effect. But the color will only revert back to red once you've touched the ground or hit a balloon, which you will see more of later. Eventually though, the difficulty ramps up pretty quickly. But by this point you should already be acquainted with your character's sense of movement in your dash, where you go sideways, upward, or diagonally with it. Timing and precision are the name of the game here. The levels in general will require you to wall jump carefully, dash with care, and time a sequence of dashes while going in the correct direction. And yes, you will die a lot the first time around. First run for me was almost 300 deaths, sitting at 280 by the time I reached the summit. In case you're wondering how I died so much, well, there's two reasons. One, I suck at the game. Two, dying is incredibly easy. Touching a spike or falling off the screen just kills you the moment you either fall off the screen completely or you make contact with a single sprite of the spike itself. But you immediately reset when you die, immediately putting you back into the action. Celeste Classic is all about trial and error, and you'll often make repeatable and dumb mistakes, leading to an alarming number of deaths along the way, which by the way is recorded on the top left of your screen showing the time and how many times you've died. Yes, Celeste Classic is hard, brutal for first time platformers, but the more you play this game, the better you get at it. And the better you get at it, the less you'll die overall, and the better you'll be able to clear the levels, even to the point of getting all of the strawberries, even the ones that fly up the moment you use the dash mechanic. And the game is so short that you can beat it in minutes. Some speedrunners in the Celeste Classic speedrunning community have beaten this game in under 2 minutes, which goes to show how short this game actually is. But for a first time player, it's going to feel longer. In saying that though, the game is one that I enjoyed so much that I wanted even more of it, and my prayers would be more or less answered in the guise of two windows. The sequel game, Celeste Classic 2, and the endless modifications of both games on the Pico 8 platform, where people have taken the source code and have created their own versions of it. Celeste Classic 2 plays a lot differently to the first one. Your character, for starters, has a different mechanic where the dash is gone, replaced with a grappling hook that you can then use to attach to walls, or the diamond-shaped objects that you can use. Some walls can't be used, and sometimes to reach other walls, you'll need to utilize the snowballs and jumping objects that are found in the levels. Speaking of the levels, the game is structured differently too. Instead of the progression going upwards, indicated by the meters, you go in multiple directions and traverse the much larger levels, with each one having their own distinct appearance. Personally, I didn't like this one as much as the first Celeste Classic. The character just doesn't feel as good to play in my opinion compared to the one in Celeste Classic 1, but it does bring its own ideas to the table that makes it stand out on its own rather than just being another sequel. But if you've exhausted both games and want more content, then the next best thing will be in the Pico 8 app or the website. Type in the keyword Celeste and you'll be shown a whole bunch of different versions of it. These people have basically taken the source code of Celeste Classic and have made their own game based on it. Some have completely different characters, different levels, or even different appearances. Some of them provide unique experiences like Celeste, which is a combination of Celeste and Hollow Knight. Instead of the dash, you have the sword, which you can use to slash downward or sideways to bounce off of spikes. It plays so well and shows what some people can do with a pre-existing game and renew it with another combination not thought of. Then there's stuff like Celeste, which is Celeste, but made to be near impossible, and is only for the elite class of Celeste players. And yes, this is only the first level. Celeste Classic Hardcore. Same as Celeste Classic, but if you die, you start back at the beginning. No thanks. Then there's shit like this. The level of quality will vary based on the one that you try, but the point is that you can find a near infinite pool of content for Celeste Classic from this approach, with other levels or characters, and even different mechanics. Speaking of the source code, you can go into any of them and change whatever you want, and it'll appear in real time as you play. Want to make the game impossible? Just set the gravity to 1. Want to do anything else? Just read through it and play around with the numbers. Pico 8 in itself is a great starting point with getting into game development. It has a large community. Games can be accessed through the source code, making for great reference material to make your own game, or even modify an existing game. The only drawback, of course, is the limited specs and the number of tokens allowed within the code. About 8,192 to be exact. This means you're not going to be making a giant sprawling game with it. Celeste Classic's source code has over 8,000 tokens written in the source code, pushing Pico 8 to its absolute limits. But the hard work really paid off because Celeste Classic is one of the most satisfying and underrated platformers you can find out there today, and it's all free. It has a great sense of movement, appealing visuals, and nice colors that blend together, and is so customizable through its source code that you can essentially make your own version of the game quite easily. Is it better than Celeste 2018 though? No. That game is a far more complete and realized version of this title. There is a reason why the people behind Celeste Classic wanted to port to a new engine, and it's because their idea was much more ambitious than what Pico 8 allowed for. But that game's greatness exists because of the foundations that Celeste Classic had set forth, and for me, has become a great example of how to make an amazing platformer. The last game I played that made me feel a sense of nirvana with platforming was, again, Celeste 2018, and another game called M++, another amazing title that has stood the test of time. But if you want a bite-sized platformer that's free and easy to run, then I implore you to play Celeste Classic, especially if you've already played the 2018 version. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.
Yeah.